Part 1. The Return. The house hadn't changed. Even after all these years, it still smelled like lemon polish and dust. The wallpaper in the hallway was faded, but intact, curling slightly at the edges, like it had something to whisper. My father's hat still hung by the door. His shoes lined up neatly below it, as if he'd be back before dinner. He wouldn't. He died 3 weeks ago. I hadn't cried. Not at the hospital, not at the funeral, not in the quiet of my car as I drove through the small town I had once called home. I didn't feel numb exactly, more like disconnected, as if the grief hadn't figured out where to land yet. I was here to prepare the house for sale. That's what I told myself. One last task before closing this chapter. But deep down, I knew it wasn't just about real estate. I hadn't set foot inside this house in 30 years. I grew up here. In this house, with its creaky floorboards and over-pruned rose bushes, my mother died when I was 12. After that, my father changed. He was always a serious man, but her death hardened him. He became a man of routines and rules, meals at 6, silence during dinner, no closed doors unless you were sleeping or bathing. No secrets in this house, he used to say. But it turns out that wasn't true. I started in a kitchen, cleared out the pantry, donated unopened cans. The fridge was mostly empty, save for mustard and an expired carton of eggs. In the living room, his recliner faced the old TV. Remote on the armrest. Blanket folded with military precision. It felt preserved, like a museum of one man's solitude. Upstairs, I found the bedroom just as I remembered. The bed with its stiff beige coverlet. A crucifix above the headboard. His dresser top was clean. Only a small photo of me as a teenager stood there, framed in brass, dusty, but present. I didn't expect that. It was the attic that caught me off guard. At the end of the upstairs hallway was a narrow door. It had always been there, but I never paid much attention to it. We called it the crawl space. Dad kept it locked, told me it was just insulation and mousetraps. I never questioned it. Now, as I stood in front of it, I saw something odd. A brass key was hanging from a nail beside the frame. My hand hovered. Why would he suddenly leave the key out? After decades of hiding it, I took it, turned it in the lock. The door opened with a groan. Inside was not a crawl space. It was a room, not a dusty, abandoned attic space. A real room. Small, square, with a slanted ceiling. There was a single bed, made neatly with a faded quilt. A desk against the far wall, scattered with books and loose papers. A dresser, a reading lamp, a stack of sketch pads. Someone had lived here, and I had never known. My breath caught. I stepped inside. The air was cool, stale. I opened the curtain, only one small window, and light poured in, revealing more details. Books on the shelf, mostly young adult fiction, some classics. Treasure Island, A Wrinkle in Time, a worn copy of To Kill a Mockingbird. Drawings pinned to the wall, pencil sketches of trees, houses, a cat. Some were quite good. One was of a little girl holding a balloon. Another looked like me. I moved to the desk. A box of letters sat in the top drawer. I opened the top envelope. To our son, happy 10th birthday. I hope this finds you well. I wish I could see you. I miss you every day. Love always, Mom. Mom? I pulled out more. Letter after letter. All addressed to our son, signed by a woman named Lena. And then I found the photo. It was my father, standing beside a boy I didn't know, They stood in front of this house. The boy looked to be maybe 12. Same eyes as mine, same chin. Who was he? Why was this room hidden? I stood there, heart pounding. My father had a secret, and it had a name. Part 2, The Hidden Life. The letters felt sacred. I sat on the bed in that secret room, holding the box on my lap, slowly pulling them out one by one. The envelopes were faded, many postmarked decades ago, all addressed to the same unnamed boy, all signed by Lena. To our son, happy 11th birthday. I hope you liked the book. I remember you loved animals. I saw a red fox last week and thought of you. To our son, I heard your school had a spring concert. I wonder if you played the piano like I used to. I hope your father clapped loud. To our son, I think about you every single day. I wish I could have been stronger. I wish I had stayed. The letters ended abruptly around what seemed to be the boy's 14th birthday. After that, nothing. I leaned back and stared at the ceiling, heart pounding. This wasn't some distant cousin. This was someone who had lived here, someone my father had hidden, someone he called son. I dug deeper into the drawers. Inside the dresser were neatly folded clothes, boys' shirts, socks, pants, no larger than what a 12-year-old might wear. There was dust on the fabric, but they were clean, preserved. Underneath the bottom drawer, taped to the base, was an envelope. My hands shook as I peeled the tape and pulled it free. It was a birth certificate. Name, Daniel Arthur Whitmore. Mother, Lena Monroe. Father, Gerald Thomas Whitmore. Date of birth, June 12th, 1974. My father's name. My last name. My brother. I sat in the attic for what felt like hours. I couldn't understand it. I was born in 1958. My mother died in 1970. My father never remarried, never dated. As far as I knew, he lived a quiet, controlled life. But sometime after my mother's death, he'd had a son, and he never told me. Why? And where was Daniel now? I spent the next day combing through the rest of the attic and the house. In the garage, behind a stack of old fishing gear, I found a locked trunk. Inside were more drawings, beautiful sketches signed DAW. There was also a stack of school papers, several report cards from the local elementary school, and a leather-bound notebook. I opened it. It wasn't a diary exactly, more like thoughts jotted down. The handwriting started childlike, then matured. Sometimes I hear Margaret talking downstairs. I don't think she knows I'm here. Dad says I can't go outside when she visits, says it's not safe. He got mad at me for asking about Mom again. I don't know why he won't tell me anything. I saw her once, Margaret. She looked like me. I froze. He saw me? He knew who I was? My throat tightened. What kind of man was my father? What kind of life did Daniel live in this house, hidden behind a door I wasn't allowed to open? The last entry in the notebook was from 1988. He says I can leave soon. He says the world is dangerous, but I'm ready. I don't think he knows I've been writing letters too. One of them is for her, me. I searched the house again, every drawer, every box, every shelf. Finally, tucked behind the furnace in the basement, I found a sealed envelope labeled in child's handwriting, for Margaret if she ever finds me. Part 3, The Brother I Never Knew. My fingers trembled as I opened the envelope. The paper inside was yellowed, creased. It smelled faintly of dust and time. The handwriting was uneven, careful, a teenager trying to sound older than he was. Dear Margaret, if you're reading this, I guess you found the attic. And the truth. I hope so. I don't know if Dad ever told you about me. I don't know if you remember me at all. But I remember you. You were the girl in the yellow dress, sitting under the willow tree in the backyard, reading books I couldn't see from the attic window. I used to pretend you were reading them to me. I sat back, stunned. Dad said you wouldn't understand, that it would be too complicated. I wanted to meet you. I wanted a sister. I'm not mad at you. I don't think this is your fault. But if you ever want to know me, I'll be at the library on Wednesdays. I started going after school, just in case you came back. Love, Daniel. The letter wasn't dated, but from the notebook entries, it had to have been written around 1988. He would have been 14. I would have been 30, and I never knew. That afternoon, I drove to the town library. I didn't know what I was looking for. The trace? A clue? The woman behind the desk was older, with silver hair and kind eyes. Her name tag read Ruth. I asked if she'd worked there long. 35 years next summer, she said proudly. I hesitated, then asked, Do you remember a boy named Daniel Whitmore? Her expression softened. Oh, Daniel. Quiet boy, always reading. He came here after school most days in the late 80s. Very polite. Loved art books. My heart raced. Do you know what happened to him? I asked. She paused. He left town suddenly. We heard later that he'd been placed in foster care. I always wondered why. He seemed so careful. Foster care? I went to the county archives. It took 2 hours, a few phone calls, and a skeptical clerk. But eventually, I got a name. Daniel Monroe. Changed after the state intervened. I found a file. Redacted. Sparse. He'd been placed in 3 different foster homes. The notes were brief. Quiet, compliant, gifted in drawing. In 1992, at age 18, the file ended with, released from state custody. And then, nothing. I searched databases, obituaries, social media. Finally, I found it. A death notice. Daniel Monroe, 1974 to 2007, died in a traffic accident. No next of kin listed. I sat in the hallway of the records office, the hum of fluorescent lights overhead, and let the tears fall. I would never meet him. That night, I reread his letter over and over. He had watched me. He had waited, and I never came. Not because I didn't want to, because I didn't know, because my father had decided that one child was enough, that one life deserved light and the other, shadows. I thought about all the Wednesdays he spent in the library, hoping I'd appear. The attic window, the sketches, the letter. I found one more thing the next day, in a sealed envelope tucked inside a book of Rilke's poetry, a letter from my father. Margaret, if you're reading this, I've gone, and you found everything. I don't know what to say to undo what I did. I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was protecting him. I was wrong. I hope someday you can forgive me. Love always, Dad. Part 4. I spent the next week in a haze. The house felt different now, like it was breathing, finally exhaling decades of silence. I walked from room to room like a stranger in a museum of lives I never knew existed. My childhood, my father's secrets, my brother's ghost. They all lived here now, layered in the walls. I kept thinking of Daniel at the library, week after week, hoping I would return. I imagined him sketching, quiet, alone. I had a brother, and I never got to say his name out loud while he was alive. I sat down with the box of letters again, this time reading them all in order. The ones from Lena told a story of heartbreak and helplessness. She had loved my father, or at least believed she did. They had met a year after my mother's death. She was young, idealistic. He was older, grieving, closed off. At first, they wrote letters. Then came the relationship. Then came the pregnancy. Then silence. He said he'd raise the child, that it would be better that way. I wasn't stable. I believed him. But then he told me I could never contact you, or him. I should have fought harder. I kept writing. He never answered. I didn't know if he gave you my letters, but I kept sending them, hoping. For years. The last letter I sent came back unopened. I stopped after that. I closed my eyes. My father had built a life on control. It hadn't always felt cruel. Sometimes it had felt like protection. Rules, boundaries, expectations. But now I saw them for what they were. Fences, walls, prison bars. I found one more diary in the attic, tucked inside the back of the closet behind Daniel's bed. It was my father's. The leather cover was dry and cracked. The pages smelled of dust and tobacco. The entries weren't dated, but they were clearly written late in his life. I hear her in the house. She sounds like her mother when she's angry. She walks fast, leaves cabinet doors open. I never taught her to be still. Daniel asked about Margaret again. I told him she moved far away. It was easier than telling him she was just down the hall, and I'd stolen her from him. Sometimes I think I split my heart in two. One half for the world, one hidden. I don't know which part was real anymore. If she ever finds this, tell her I was wrong. He never left me a letter in his own hand, only this journal. It was enough. I called the cemetery. I found Daniel's grave, a modest plaque in a quiet section of a rural plot 2 towns over. No flowers, no epitaph, just a name and 2 dates. I brought lilies, sat on the grass, read him his own letter. "And sorry I never came back," I whispered. "But I know now, and I won't forget." That evening, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around. I had come here to empty a house. Now it was full of truth, full of voices, full of love that had been locked away for too long. Part 5. The room I left open. It took me 3 weeks to decide. I sat with the boxes of letters, drawings, and old notebooks spread out across the dining table. Every morning, I would make a pot of coffee, sit in the same chair, and read a few pages. Some days I wept. Other days I smiled. Some pages were too heavy to open. Others made me feel like I was sitting across from Daniel, like he was here beside me, finally seen. One afternoon, I called Claire, my daughter, and asked her to come home. We hadn't always been close. She'd moved away young, eager to escape what she called the cold. She meant the silence, the way I'd inherited our father's habit of not talking about feelings. But I didn't want to keep this story to myself. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, holding Daniel's letter in her hands. "Mom," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "he was my uncle." "I know," I said, "and I never knew he existed." She reached for my hand. "Let's make sure he's not forgotten." I went to the library, the same one where Daniel had waited for me, and asked if they accepted personal donations. They did. We created an archive, the Daniel Whitmore Letters, A Lost Life Remembered. The letters were scanned, cataloged, his drawings laminated and displayed in a quiet corner, beneath a small brass plaque that read, "He waited, he wondered, he mattered." People came, quietly. Some asked questions, others didn't. I sat on a bench nearby and listened to them read. A group of high school students visited on a field trip. One of them whispered, "It's like reading someone's heart." I smiled. The house was too full of ghosts to sell, but not the kind that haunt, the kind that teach. I called a local social worker, told her what I wanted to do. We turned the house into a retreat space, a safe haven for foster teens who'd aged out of the system, a place to stay, to heal. To be seen. I named it the Willow House after the tree where Daniel saw me reading as a child. The attic room stayed the same. We didn't use it as a bedroom. Instead, it became a quiet place for reflection. We left his books on the shelf, his sketches on the wall, the letters in a box labeled gently, for anyone who's ever felt hidden. On the last day before we opened the house to its first residents, I walked through one more time, room by room, down the hallway. To the attic door. I left it open, not because I had nothing more to hide, but because I was ready to be found. Sometimes I dream of Daniel. He sits under the willow tree, sketching. I sit beside him, and we don't speak. We just share the quiet. He hands me a pencil. I draw a door, and together we walk through it. The end.